Welcome to the Wellbeing Scrutiny Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission meeting on Tuesday 11th of May. This is a formal meeting of the Hackney Council, and all the usual constitutional requirements of the council meetings apply. The rights of the press and public to record and film the meeting will continue to apply, and media representatives may be in attendance or viewing the live stream. It should be noted that whilst members of the Commission are present here at the Town Hall, officers will be connecting via a live link. I would also like to remind members present and officers connecting virtually that this meeting continues to be held in public and is being broadcast live via the internet. In terms of operability, can you please note the following. Unless you are speaking, please keep your microphone muted. And if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand to get the attention of the chair. Please keep your camera on so that it can help the chair to identify who would like to speak. Apologies for delay and thank you for your patience. First item is the election of chair and vice chair. Can I take any nominations for the post of chair, please?
I nominate Councillor Conway.
Seconded.
Do you have any nominations? Then I declare that Councillor Conway is the chair of the Scrutiny Commission. I'll hand over to Councillor Conway.
Thank you very much. Can I ask the Commission to vote on position of Vice Chair?
I nominate Gordon.
Seconded.
Thank you very much. So Councillor Gordon is duly elected as Vice Chair to the Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission. Before we start the agenda, I would like to make a number of announcements. Firstly, I would like to note that Salma Kanzara will be the new nominated representative of the North London Muslim Community Centre on this commission. Salma will replace Shuja Sheikh, who has been a co-opted representative for a number of years. I would like to formally thank Shuja for his ongoing support for the work of the commission. Salma will be formally co-opted onto the commission in June. Secondly, as you may be aware, Anne Canning, our Group Director for Education and Children's Services, is retiring at the end of this month, and this will therefore be her last Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission meeting. I would just like to thank Anne for her support for the work of this commission, and of course for all her work in supporting children and young people services across Hackney for a number of years. On behalf of the commission, I would like to wish Anne all the best for a happy retirement. Right.
Something in the chat bar from a member that I couldn't. It went by just asked too
Councillor
quickly.
Woodley saying she can't see people in the room.
Oh,
Yep.
that's because. There you are.
Okay.
As if I might.
Okay, so item 2, terms of reference. Members of the Commission are asked to note the terms of reference for the Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission, which are contained in Article 7 and Section 4.5 of the Constitution. These excerpts are provided within the agenda pack. Item 3, apologies for absence. I have apologies from Ernell Watson, Justine MacDonald, Shabnam Hassan, Michael Lobenstein and Councillor Lynch. Do we have any other apologies for absence?
No other apologies.
Thank you. Moving on to item 4, urgent items, order of business. There are no urgent items and the agenda is as published. Item 5, declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? Councillor Gordon?
I have a declaration of interest in relation to the item on mental health in the Child Workers and Advisory Law at the Department of Health. So I won't be asking any questions that impinge on that.
Thank you very much. Richard Brown?
Items on exclusions and school places. I'm the executive head of the Erswood School and New Regents College.
Thank you very much. James?
Mine is just a general declaration that I'm a governor of the Garden School.
Joe?
And I'm a governor at Sir Thomas Abney School.
Thank you very much. Now moving on to item 6, SEND performance and recovery plan. The Commission has requested a strategic update on SEND services from Hackney Education Service, particularly in relation to service performance, finance and recovery plans. A report is enclosed within the agenda papers. Can I ask officers to summarise key issues from the report for a couple of minutes, then we can go straight into questions. For this item, we have Fran Cox, the Head of High Needs and School Places, and Annie Gammon, the Director of Education. So handing over to you both.
Thank you very much, Councillor Conway. Good to be with you all. Just to say, as Councillor Conway has said, we're here to give an update on a range of issues related to services for children and young people with SEND, and indeed the finance issues related to that. I'm going to hand over to Fran, who probably is her first scrutiny meeting, coming into the role of Head of High Needs and School Places 5 weeks in, and she will present the report.
Thank you, Annie. Lovely to be with you all tonight. I think it's well known and well documented that local authorities, SEND communities are in a very challenging position when it comes to children and young people with SEND, and the obligations to ensure that we deliver outstanding provision for them and outstanding services. And Hackney Education is working in partnership with families, children and young people themselves, and the wider stakeholders to ensure that we have just that in Hackney. There's been a whole-scale review to make sure that we put in place a number of project streams to inform an improvement in a number of areas, and the detail of which is included in the plan. We are putting together a programme approach to make sure that there are targeted and timely improvements in place. And a key element of the success in that is going to be the partnership working with the community as a whole, and with main outcomes looking at a reduction in the deficit within the high needs budget, but also an improvement of local provision. We have a lot of children and young people who currently are educated outside of the borough, and we want to make sure that that is not the case in the coming years. And there's a real multi-agency view that we ought to bring children and young people closer within their community so they can be educated and looked after with their siblings and with their families in their communities. So there's a number of elements to that which are detailed in the report. I'm very happy to take questions around specific items that people would like to know more around.
We're not able to hear the council room.
You should be able to, if you just speak.
Turn the microphone off.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay. The demand for SEND services is currently running at an increased level each year. For EHCP plans, it's running at 16 to 17% increase per annum. What strategic analysis has been undertaken around this increase, particularly the underlying factors? And are we expecting demand to continue at current levels? In particular, has data been collected to understand the different categories of SEND and the respective support needs for those different types of SEND? And secondly, connected to that, a question regarding the time of delivery for EHC plans. Just over 40% are completed in the statutory 20-week time period. What can we learn from higher performing local authorities to ensure that more EHCP plans are completed within the statutory timescales? And to what extent is this problem of delays to do with the capacity of personnel, and in particular a shortage of educational psychologists in the borough? Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think if I answer the first part about the analysis of the increase, and then I'll hand over to Fran to answer about the EHCP timeliness. I think there are several factors. One is the move that happened, as members of the scrutiny panel will know, to extend what were statements to education healthcare plans and to extend their provision up to the age of 25. So we have increasing numbers of young people over 18 and larger cohorts coming through into that group who still need the provision of an education healthcare plan, quite rightly. So that's one area of increase. The other area is across age groups, although the majority of young people, children who get education healthcare plans do so in the peak year is reception year as children enter into mainstream schooling, but it's not the only year where that happens. But there is an increase in the number of children being diagnosed on the autistic spectrum. The increase is not uncommon across different boroughs, although we are at the high end. One of the strategies we are using with partners, indeed it's one of the top 3 priorities for the SEND Partnership Board, is to look at a graduated response to make sure that any child who has special needs, who's in a mainstream school, that there is a spectrum of support available before getting to the point of having an education healthcare plan. We want every child who's entitled to a plan to have one, and Fran will talk about the speed at which they can get one shortly and the increase there. But we also know that there are a range of special educational needs that can be dealt with in a mainstream school with well-trained staff and some adjustments to what is available to all children. Fran, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Annie. So in terms of the timeliness of the 20 weeks that education healthcare planning assessments should take place, so we've made a marked improvement on the 40% of last year, and we're now at 69% of plans being completed within those timescales. That's in comparison to the national average of 58%. And I think that really depicts the national issue when nationally we're only managing collectively to get 58% of plans undertaken on time. There's a number of factors at play there. The essence of the Children and Families Act and the essence of the SEND reforms moved away from just a legal document towards more of a co-produced live living document that really depicted the needs of the child and young person. And to do that, you've got to get to know the young person, the family, and you've got to delve deeper than perhaps one would do in the days of the statement. So it's really important we don't just focus on this KPI and push colleagues to do more and more quickly and then lose the essence of what it means to undertake an assessment, because we could make 100 but the plan quality would deteriorate. So there's a balance to be had there, and we're working with the planning teams to make sure we get that balance right. We are above national average, but we would not like to rest there, and we're aiming to get more and more plans complete within the statutory timescales. In answer to your question around why, I think it is the sheer volume. So that 70% increase in the last year, that's in the context of no additional staff. So we are looking at how to create a structure which is sustainable and structure that can deal with the increased demand. And educational psychologists, you're right to note as well, for every plan that's written by a plan coordinator, there's a number of professionals that need to feed into that plan, and at the heart of that is the educational psychology team. So we're looking at ways as part of the invest to save approach that we do invest in good professionals to make sure that we get these plans written in a timely and structured way, but we do it within the essence of what this means rather than just simply focus on a time scale.
Thank you. Fran, did you have any follow-up questions, Jo? Are you?
Well, I suppose it follows slightly on from that is a reference to the recent report from the Education Policy Institute, which, as you will know, have recently published a national investigation into the issue of SEND support. And going back to the first question, talking about the priority from the SEND Partnership Board to have a more graduated response and to fulfil needs before the need for an EHCP plan. What this report found was that the degree of support received was based not so much on needs and personal circumstances, but on which primary school young people attend, and particularly if there is a good record of SEND support. It also noted that academies tended to have a depressed rate of SEND referral and support. My question is, what variations of SEND referral and support across schools in Hackney, and how can we go about ensuring that all schools are equipped to consistently and effectively refer and support young people with SEND, particularly at that level of SEND support before in schools, before EHCP plans are needed?
Thank you. If I start, and Fran, if you, I think it's absolutely crucial that staff in mainstream schools are skilled and well trained, and in particular that the SENCO, who is the person who leads on the provision of special educational needs and is responsible for making sure that other colleagues in the school are well trained, has support and has central support, and we certainly provide that. We would like to do that even more so through more conferences for SENCOs, through particular training, and through the work we do with those professionals, and indeed across the whole staff in schools. There is variation in number of referrals from different primary schools, but that there can be a number of factors behind that. Often the numbers might be 2, 3, 4 per primary school, so they're small numbers, and it can sound like, well, one school's got double another, but it's 2 going to 4. So there is variation, but we think that the key is the work with SENCOs and indeed with all school staff, and that's certainly a priority for us to take forward. Fran, you want to add?
Yeah, thank you, Annie. I think the one thing to add is that when we're looking at our commissioning strategy in relation to our provision, we are really keen not just to look at places, but also to outreach elements from our specialist provision into our mainstream settings to make sure that Children and Families Act places a high order on mainstream schools in terms of their care and their inclusion of children and young people with SCN, and some of those children are presenting with a high level of needs without technically qualifying for specialist provision. So we really want to make sure that we're supporting our schools to include those children and young people who simply will find it difficult to be in a class of 30, but yet still very much benefit from being part of a mainstream school. So that is definitely part of our wider scale review around how we wrap support around mainstream schools and the children and young people themselves.
Will that specifically include increased funding for schools to commission things like speech and language therapists, educational psychologists, occupational therapists? Because I think a lot of it, schools often feel there is more they could do, but they only have so many hours of support for the whole school population in a year.
I think certainly we want to review all aspects of the education, health and care planning process, and that includes the funding that goes alongside it, and finding more creative ways to make minimal funding in schools and minimal funding within our centralised high needs block go further. And that will include the potential of joint commissioning with health and social care within Hackney, but also looking at partnerships with our neighbouring authorities as well, if that is appropriate. We definitely know that we need to be more innovative and think more creatively about how we make what we have go further, because there's no sign that we're going to get any more in a context of a highly increasing need. So we do need to be more creative, and we're working in partnerships with all involved really to make sure that we come to a solution together rather than something that one party thinks will work.
Thank you, Fran. Do we have other questions? Councillor Gordon? Yeah, Councillor Hanson.
I realise I'm at risk of keeping with my reputation as a nerd. An increase of 0.7% is not correct in this report. It's 0.7 percentage points, which is not the same thing. Just saying.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
But it does matter.
Yeah, it does.
It really is completely different.
Yeah.
I won't take up the time of the meeting explaining why, but it is different.
Thank you for drawing our attention to that. Do we have any further questions for Fran and Annie? Councillor Gordon.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. There's obviously considerable cost pressures on the SEND budget, and the commissioning of independent and non-maintained schools, many of them falling outside the borough, is a big contributor to the 8.7 million overspend forecast for the end of the financial year 2021. My question really is in two parts. I mean, firstly, what plans do you have to mitigate this expenditure? Hopefully, with plans to bring back, to increase the SEND provision for children of all ages, and with all types of SEND diagnosis within the borough in the medium term, and also. There's obviously very significant public concern about one particular provider of SEND education that is within the borough at the moment, particularly in relation to their relationships with trade unions, and also with there has been some questions in relation to the standard of education. So the question is really in that, is what sort of oversight are you able to give to the providers of special needs education, whether they're within or without the borough, and also in relation to, in terms of procurement, what measures being made to make sure that those institutions have, appropriate relationships with trade unions and recognise trade unions within their staff, and also have, provide. As well as a high standard of education, appropriate and collaborative relationships with trade unions, and good treatment of staff. Thank you.
So before I answer the first question, would you like to answer the first element first, or would it be helpful for?
I just wanted to come in. I think also to sort of say that very much welcome you, Fran, and the way you have absolutely hit the ground running, and this has been quite a key issue since you joined us, but also to sort of thank Nick Wilson, who was in post before you joined us, and has quite clearly set out a path to improvement across SEND, but in this area in particular. I sat down with Nick numerous times over the last year to look at the question of our cumulative deficit, which, if you include the amount rolled over, Councillor Gordon, will come to 13 million at the end of the year, and we don't have any sort of clear assurances from government as yet as to how we might reduce that amount, and that's something that you'll be aware that we've been regularly writing to the Secretary of State about, and we have seen some funding put in place in other councils, but it's those with even larger and more concerning deficits. So you can see that this is a national issue of great concern. But when I sat down with Nick Wilson, we looked at specifically our areas of high cost and agreed that we needed to look at how best to increase places in borough. And with that in mind, I'd draw your attention to 3.6.5 in the paper that was provided, where we are, clearly setting out our commitment to increasing placement options in borough. Indeed, we've already made progress on that with capital funding, which has allowed us to create 84 places as set out in the paper. And we have secured a similar amount of capital funding quite recently allocated, which Fran might want to speak to, in the context of our ambitions to create further places again. The one thing I would say in regard to the setting that you have mentioned that has obviously received an awful lot of attention is that we are extremely concerned about that. We're conscious that there has been something like 20 days of strike action at that setting now, which is unusual to see. We're pleased to see that the regional trade union involved in that dispute is in negotiation now with the setting. Myself and Deputy Mayor Bramble have actually met with the CEO of the group responsible for the setting and the head teacher of the setting on 2 occasions now. The most recent was yesterday, along with the chair of Scrutiny Commission, actually, who was able to join us. And we have been constantly asking for them to move to a place of settling the dispute as swiftly as possible, and also look for reassurance that staff relations in the setting will be good after the dispute. We believe that it's a good educational setting. We believe that the provision in place is good for our children. It's a setting that some of our families in Hackney do want to place their, actively want to place their children at. We have 33 children there, and we believe that they have a good opportunity for education there, but we don't believe that an educational environment is complete if you don't have good staff relations. And we've been seeking assurances that at the end of this dispute that those staff relations and trust will be rebuilt. And we have received assurances to that end, but obviously we need to see how things play out. But I'll hand over to Fran for the bigger picture.
Absolutely. I echo your comments there around Nick Wilson. I think he did a fantastic job over the last year doing a whole-scale review around the deficit and the overspend, and considering how we might look to be more strategic in moving forward in approaching that in the context of the reality of an incredibly high increase in children and young people that we're looking after within that budget. And one item most definitely, as you rightly pointed out, is the children and young people that are placed in independent and non-maintained schools, some of which are located in Hackney, but a lot of which are located outside of Hackney. And we are currently undertaking a wide-scale review of all of those placements and reforming our commissioning strategy. And obviously the school in question is part of that review, making sure that our contractual arrangements are refreshed and reflective of 2021 post-pandemic, hopefully post-pandemic. And we're making sure that we align that with an ever-increasing need. So that's in the wider context of the aspiration that in the medium term we would develop enough provision within borough that only the very most complex children we would need to seek and out of borough independent places. The majority would be cared for and looked after in their community. And the benefit of that, not only for the children and young people, is great, not having to be transported to another location, picked up earlier, dropped off later to home, sometimes staying overnight, but being able to be educated locally with their local services and potentially alongside their siblings in mainstream schools is definitely the best for children and young people. So there's a wider strategy ongoing around the education estate to see how we do that. And as mentioned previously, some of that will be new provision, some of that will be new provision attached to mainstream schools, some of that might be outreach into mainstream schools. And we're looking to be as creative as possible in what we commission and make sure it aligns with the needs that are currently presenting with the children and young people growing. Our forecasts suggest that the increase will continue in terms of the number of specialist places needed. And we want to make sure that we don't just find a solution for now or for the next few years, but for the next 5 to 10 years, and make sure we do that and get best value for the public money that we are tasked with. And I think that will be, some of that will be fairly quick. Councillor Woodley's already referred to the 84 places that we've already delivered this year. Some of that will be ongoing into next academic year, and some of that we will plan for the next 2 or 3 years, but in a graduated way. And we hope to be able to be more specific around what our plans are and consult with schools and with parents in the coming months around what that looks like.
Thanks, Fran. And I just wanted to come back about the particular school where there were concerns. As Councillor Woodley had said, the concerns focus more on the employee relations. There were concerns raised about the quality of education. There have been 2 checks done, one by Ofsted in March and one by our head of SEND, Jo Wilson, and our school improvement advisor with particular responsibility for SEND, Josephine Tupman. And they found the quality, that was in April, their visit, was a short notice visit for a day, and they found the quality of education was good for the children attending the school. So we were reassured about that, but as Councillor Woodley has said, we have been putting pressure on and encouraging the school to resolve the dispute.
Thank you. Do we have further questions from the Commission? Councillor Gordon.
Thanks very much. I mean, obviously, the concerns in relation to this setting, I think, are probably things that are shared by everyone in this room, as well as a good many people outside it. Obviously, one of the things about the publicity surrounding this setting has been to shine a light on the cost of some places in private settings, which I gather are around 60,000 per pupil, and that which compares unfavourably with the similar costs in the garden school. So, obviously, I think there are really, it is very urgent that, that we should find a way to find local, state provision for our children, not only for the reasons of their welfare, but also for financial reasons. And I just really wondered how you think you're going to be able to unlock that type of funding. Obviously, it's very encouraging to hear that there are 84 places, but what plans are, to meet this, really important need in the current very, difficult funding climate? Where do you anticipate the money is going to come from?
I think we probably have a strategy at the moment, for a developing strategy rather than a plan with a timeline next to it. But there are, and I think one of the things it's important to think about is it isn't necessarily good for a child to move partway through their school life. If they're at a school, they're at start age 11, expecting to be there till 16, it's not necessarily a good thing to move them partway through. So some of the costs are sort of wired in for a few years for children, and also we don't have current spaces available, specialist spaces of that type available in the borough. Our strategy is that we do create more local spaces, as Fran has said. There is some capital money that the central government has made available. It won't be sufficient, but we do hope to look at sort of cost benefit analysis, and it may be that we can show our council, that our own council, that it would be worth investing some money to build particular provision, because it would give cost benefits over a relatively feasible amount of time.
I have a question from Richard, but just on that point, I just wonder if you have any plans to involve parents and children and young people in deciding how this capital investment will be spent.
Yes, we're looking, as Fran said, at that provision, and the part of that will be consulting, talking with representatives from children and parents about what they think is most important.
Thank you, Annie. Richard.
Welcome, Fran, and I wish you every success in what has been a role and resolving an issue that has proved difficult in the long term. Just in the short term, can we ensure that a piece of work is done to ensure that the independent out-of-borough settings are delivering what we're already paying for? Because when I speak to parents, they tell me about instances where young people are getting an hour's education a day, or are only there mornings, who don't seem to be getting anything close to 25 hours a week. And I think that is an urgent piece of work, and probably just involves talking to some parents on the phone to see where this is happening, and then putting in place things to stop it.
I think, Richard, it would be useful to know if those are pupils at the Earswick or at New Regents.
This would be students that were at New Regents and have subsequently been placed elsewhere.
So they're
in out-of-borough special schools.
Placed by New Regents or by?
Placed by a Hackney Send.
Absolutely, Richard. I think, yes, just to give you assurance, that is absolutely part of the wider scale review. Not only are we looking at our processes in terms of the contractual arrangements, but making sure that we have all of those protective systems in place to monitor exclusion, attendance, and progress as well. As you'd expect. But yeah, absolutely. And I think I would encourage you, if any parents particularly have concerns, just to ask them to make contact with myself or Jo Wilson, who's the head of SEND, and and we will be happy to deal with any individual cases.
Thank you. I think Councillor Gordon has a follow-up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. I mean, there's obviously been certainly evidence presented to Audit Committee recently indicated that there are falling roles across many of Hackney's schools. I wonder whether this provides an opportunity to unlock some of the existing buildings and also provide more specialist SEND places within existing settings.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the things that we're looking at as we take forward the development of the strategy, because you're right, there are opportunities there. And while we're, in some ways we don't want to see that drop in number of children, it does free up some space. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions on this item? I just wanted to say actually that in relation to the points that have been raised and discussed in relation to a particular independent SEND setting in the borough, as Councillor Gordon said, it's brought quite a lot of the concerns that we as a Commission share to the fore, and it's just reaffirmed for us, I think, the importance for us to look into this matter at a future meeting. So we're going to be putting SEND procurement in light of the review of the contracts on our July meeting, on the agenda for our July meeting, where we hope to explore these concerns in greater detail in light quite specifically of what's transpired in relation to this setting and some of the things that have also been raised today by Richard. Okay, thank you everybody for your contributions towards that item. We're moving on now to item 7, which is pupil movement. In response to the Commission's work on off-rolling in schools, Hackney Education Service agreed to provide annual updates on the number of pupil movements. This is the first update which will help the Commission maintain oversight of a number of demographics of the children who have been permanently excluded from school, are receiving education in an alternative provision setting, have moved from school into elective home education, have changed schools through the Manage Move process. For this item, we have Chris Roberts, Head of Wellbeing and Education, Safeguarding, and Annie Gammon, who is the Director of Education. A short report is contained within the agenda pack. Can I ask officers to summarise key points from the report for no more than 2 to 3 minutes before we move on to questions, please?
Thank you, Councillor Conway. Councillor Bramble, did you want to say anything, or should we go straight into?
Thank you, Annie. Just to say that pupil movement is an important item for scrutiny to be looking at, and clearly the pandemic has had an impact on that too. Officers will speak about some actions that we have been taking, and school by school, and looking at the disproportionality in some areas, and possibly they'll talk about some of the work that we've been doing in schools around reducing exclusions, but also touching on some of the anti-racism work that we've been doing in school as well. Annie, thank you. Back to you.
Thanks, Councillor Bramble. Yes, so I want to say a few words about what schools have been doing, and then Chris will talk about what actions officers have been taking. And I should say that Marion Lavelle is also here to answer any questions, particularly about in-year movement. So I think it's sort of been an extremely unusual year in terms of children being in school or being at home, and indeed movement. I think that the figures therefore have been affected by that. You will see that some figures are higher than usual, some are lower than usual, but we think there are some patterns that would have happened anyway. We've had, as the Commission will be aware, a really increased emphasis on inclusion in all our mainstream schools, and with the wish to having the impact of reducing exclusions. And while exclusions have dropped, you will see that, and that's certainly been affected by the pandemic. We also think that some of the work done in schools, partly influenced by us, would have ensured that there was a drop anyway. So there have been significant initiatives going on. I think the other section I wanted to talk about in terms of what schools do is the section 5, which is about off-rolling. Just to say, this talks about where there is any pupil movement between the number of pupils in year 9 and year 11, and you will note that the percentage of movement has dropped. It does mention there are 2 schools with over 10%, and just to say that one had significant turbulence at the time, so that will change, and the other was using that movement to make sure that children had good access to an alternative curriculum. So to broaden a range of pathways. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that section, and I'm going to hand over to Chris.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Chair. I think within the report there, what we tried to do is point that contrast between what the picture was before the pandemic, the impact of the pandemic, and the sort of as schools returned in September. As you'll notice, like we had within particularly large children missing education, the numbers during that first lockdown period dropped off and then rose quite sharply in the early parts of September again, and the reports of children missing education. A lot of that was children, as they were then reported to us, who'd gone abroad and left the country back to home countries, particularly in Europe, which you can see to some extent through the ethnicity data of the young people that have referred in that period, over that period, with a quite high number of children that are from white other backgrounds, a lot of those from Eastern Europe and Western Europe as well, and quite a few went that way. We've also, as you will see there, a significant rise in the number of children coming into elective home education, particularly in September and October, as schools returned. Most of that was almost down to COVID, and some of it was to do with anxiety and concerns of parents returning at that point, though some of it was a positive choice as well. Some parents had enjoyed the experience of actually educating their children over lockdown through homeschooling and wanted to continue that. So what we have, and that reflected in similar increases that have happened nationally. That's not just a Hackney figure, that's nationally there's been a significant rise in elective home education. You'll notice that particularly families from black ethnic backgrounds and from the traveller community were kind of disproportionately moving into home education during this period. Throughout this, we've tried to engage with our families, and we've managed to maintain our relationship through those, and particularly through some targeted work that we've done with some families around the traveller community. We've started to see children returning to school, and those numbers have started to decline. As so for some, concluding elective home education is not for them and deciding actually they want their children to return to schools. For others, it's more a case of they just that the anxieties have lessened, and actually they're more confident about returning their children now. We also had a recent very internal audit of the services around children missing education and elective home education, which I'm very pleased reported no recommendations, and was very positive and complimentary about some of the progress that had been made in this area around the service delivery. As you'll see, permanent exclusions over this period, particularly from the return to school, have diminished quite significantly. A lot of that's down to a lot of the behaviour systems that have been put in place in schools. As I say, very to say to whether it's how much this is the impact of the pandemic versus the impact of the steps we've got to take, but some of that will play out. But as Annie said, I'm sure some of it will relation to the interventions we put in place. The main area of concern there is about the high level of disproportionality still still exists around some of our permanent exclusions and our managed moves, where around half the pupils that both experience a managed move and permanent exclusion are from black ethnic backgrounds, and that's something obviously that Hackney Education is working closely with schools and the work that we're putting in place there. And like that, likewise, then reflects in our pupil population in New Regents College and alternative provision. That is largely just then reflective of the demographics of children that get excluded. But as you'll notice there, the numbers have significantly dropped from September as the year 11s left, and with the reduction in exclusions we've got coming in, there's fewer children coming into New Regents, so the numbers at New Regents are much lower than we would normally anticipate at this time of year.
Thank you very much. Joe, I think, did you have a couple of questions that you wanted to ask? Again, if we can ask them together.
Yes, I mean, part of my question has already been answered. I was interested to ask about the drop in exclusions and really whether there is any learning from lockdown that can contribute to maintaining the lower levels of school exclusions, and to what extent we can attribute that to perhaps changes in behaviour policies in schools.
I mean, for all of our schools throughout this period and throughout this term, both in the autumn term and as we're preparing through the second or third lockdown in January, one of the things we did to have a lot of discussions with heads and done through wellbeing and deputy heads is learning the lessons about what do you want to keep, what's worked for you from this period, what's good practice. And we've done quite a lot of sharing around practice through some of our network meetings around what behaviour strategies have been implemented so that schools have learned from that. So we've actively pushed that and promoted that with schools and saying that let's learn the lessons from this period and what's worked in your school about the systems, the rotas, the procedures you have in place that's impacted positively on pupil behaviour. And I think all of them are doing that kind of lessons of what do we want to keep, what do we want to get rid of.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. On the point of disproportionality, it's encouraging to hear that that you have been doing some work with families to unpick the reasons behind, for example, the increase in elected home education. But I think what's struck me, as I'm sure it's struck many of the other members of the Commission, is that we're hearing about the same groups of young people throughout. So we're talking about Black children, children from travelling backgrounds who are overrepresented, not just in exclusion statistics, but now also in the increase in the elected home education, but also in terms of poor attainment. It doesn't paint a particularly good picture, I have to say. For me, it feels as though families are either opting out, don't feel they're being adequately served by the services that are provided, or being excluded. Are we doing anything to really look at the picture that this is painting? Because it feels to me to be quite a damning one.
I think, the work that's happening around some of the Young Black Men project and the interventions around raising awareness about unconscious bias, and developing cultural competency and cultural literacy with leaders, and the development of the curriculum around this, around young Black students, or hopefully make a more inclusive school system around that for them. Particularly, they're also working around our traveller community. Our traveller education officer does particular progress work, particularly in those schools that have high concentrations of families from the traveller back community, and does particular work around them at how to make sure those young people are included, how to make sure those young people are engaged with their education system, that acts often very much as a bridge between the families and the school to help overcome any issues and challenges that may arise. So there's quite a lot of work that goes around that, and interventions to try and support those and make those sessions as welcoming and as inclusive and as flourishing as possible for those communities to actually progress educationally.
Thank you. I appreciate that we're having an overview of these things, but I'm just wondering that for each, because I just noted in the report that what was referenced was the broader work that we're doing to look at these things. But I just wonder what is each officer that's tasked with looking at these issues? To what extent are these issues of disproportionality at the forefront of their minds?
I think in terms of, certainly internally, we've had that same unconscious bias training. Equality forms part of a strand of all our service plans within Hackney Education. But these are very much at the forefront about how we try and reduce some of the disproportionalities that happen, both through in terms of our practice and the interventions that we put in place. So these are very much live issues that we do address both as managers and with the officers and staff in terms of the planning and the work that we do to try and, first of all, recognise the challenges that there are around the data and some of the disproportionality we recognise that exist, and then trying to work to overcome those, both with schools and the families, and trying to overcome those challenges. But it's very much something that's live for us, and it's not a bolt-on and add-on. It's very integral to the work that we do.
Thank you, Chris. Do you have any questions, Councillor Gordon?
Thank you, Chair. Obviously there's been, a very, very significant increase in the numbers of families choosing to electively home educate their children, and as indicated in the report, these are for a number of different reasons. Could you give us some and I very much share the Chair's concern in relation to the overrepresentation of certain groups of children, which are, overrepresented in a number of areas of scrutiny of this Commission. Could you give us some indication in relation to the amount of support and officer resource that's been you've been able to provide for these families? Because it's obviously been a very, very significant increase in this. These families, you know, may well have different needs. I mean, they may well feel, for example, families who had concerns about the health of family members may have felt forced into a position of taking their children out of school and, you know, choosing to electively home educate them. I mean, how much has there been any increase in officer resource, and what sort of support have those families had on an individual basis to really identify their, you know, what is needed to support them during this pandemic in this very difficult period?
I mean, very much at the beginning. I mean, there was an increase during back in last summer. There was an increase in the resource that was agreed around the level of staffing from a 0.5 officer around home education up to a full-time officer. That was implemented back last summer anyway, pre the rise that was coming in place. What we established with schools over the beginning of the autumn term, as these numbers, we were asking schools, first of all, not to remove children out to home education initially, and to allow us to have that conversation firstly with parents. So we had that opportunity to engage with them at the outset to make sure, try and unpick the reasons as to why they may want to move into home education and what the reasons were, and if there was any kind of myths that we could bust, or any issues we would get engaging with that. As the numbers crept up, we've engaged an agency worker to help with stay on top of things like assessments and top of the assessments around home education that are in place. We've had an agency teacher in place alongside our normal one, and one of the advantages, particularly around the decline in exclusions, is freed up some officer time. So we've borrowed some of that officer time to help support around the home education elements. So not necessarily doing the home education assessments, but doing some engagement with families, and that's part of the work that's enabled us to get some of those children coming back into the school system, and also basically check on the welfare of the children that are coming out as well, and for underpinning our sort of safeguarding duties. And likewise the work of the traveller education officer as well. She's pivoted some of her work to particularly focus on some of those children from the traveller community who've opted to home education, and work with them again about reassurance and getting those children back into schools. So it's been a bit of a team effort, and we focus some of the resources on this community around this, partly blessed by a little bit by the reduction of exclusions, which has given us a little bit more capacity to do that work. So we've had quite a bit of effort to engage with those communities around that and establish what their motivations were and whether we can actually overcome some of those. And schools were very good in that early inset, not removing children immediately from role. If we could turn around and say to schools in terms of say, actually, we've persuaded this parent to come back to school. So we had some of those, but there was obviously some who were insistent at that point they were not going to send their children back and did want to carry on.
And we also worked closely with our health colleagues to be able to give individual advice to families where they had those, understandable anxieties about somebody in the household with a medical condition, and was it safe for that person in the home to have somebody in the house going to school. And there were a number of those, and I think the health advice was really supportive for a number of them.
Thank you. I've got a question from Richard and then Councillor Hanson.
Chris, thank you for the work you do, which I have direct experience of. Just in terms of your report around New Regent's College and alternative provision, and I've already declared my interest earlier, could you just confirm that in the year prior to the pandemic, New Regent's actually did a lot of work on primary partnership placements, which helped reduce primary rates of permanent exclusion? That work wasn't possible this year because it involves youngsters being in more than one bubble, because they spend half their time at New Regent's and other time in the primary school. So could you just confirm that to some extent the reduction in primary learners at New Regent's is a good thing, because it means that preventative work has taken place, which has led to the reduction in permanent exclusions?
Indeed, that's the case. The primary permanent partnership placements were fundamental to helping reduce our primary permanent exclusions. And we've now not, I don't want to jinx it, but we've not had a primary permanent exclusion now since sort of 2018. And the partnership work that goes with New Regents around those partnership placements is a key part of our interventions and strategies around that, along with the work of the re-engagement units and other partners and other services that we have helped work that work. So the numbers there, as you see in the report, the number of primary New Regents particularly has dropped for those reasons particularly over the autumn term, for the reasons Richard said around the bubbles. But we've managed to sustain it also, particularly around exclusions at primary, no exclusions at prominent.
Thank you.
Chair, if I could just quickly add that really just to commend the work done in the primary schools in Hackney in terms of the reduction on permanent exclusions. I think there's lessons to be learned, and we're trying to take that forward to the secondary sector. I don't think that's really been acknowledged, that the work that has gone on in the primary sector, and Rich spoke about the work that he's done with primaries. I think that really should be acknowledged. I think we're in the right direction of travel, but there's still work to be done. No one has mentioned race, and I just think we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable talking about race. It's just something that we shouldn't just kind of back away from and feel shy from. I know lots of our schools as well have been, especially secondary schools, have really embraced the work in trying to reduce exclusions, taking on conscious bias training, cultural competency. We had a successful Year 7 no exclusion pilot that's been run out. So there are strategies that we are working forward, and I would say there's been, I'm sure Annie will agree, a real commitment from the secondary sector to begin to address this, but we don't excuse it in any way. We're very good at educating. We are working to be better in how we support those children that need our support in different ways. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Bramble. Do we have further questions? I think Councillor Hanson.
Yeah, thank you. I just wondered on paragraph 9.6, it mentions the Fair Access Panel, but I can't find anywhere else in the paper what that panel is and who's on it. And then it also mentions waiting credit under the Fair Access Protocol. Again, I don't know what that is.
Chris, might you be able to shed some light on that waiting, or Annie, sorry.
I will let Marion talk about the Fair Access Panel and how it works. And that's probably best, and she'll talk about the waiting as well.
Yeah, I'll just describe it very simply. Every local education authority is required to have a Fair Access Protocol panel, and that panel, the purpose of it is to ensure that children that aren't offered a place through the normal in-year process, a place is found for them very quickly. And sometimes children that have challenging behaviour aren't offered a place through the in-year process because schools are allowed to refuse admission. Sometimes there simply isn't a vacancy. If that happens, we in the admission team take them to the Fair Access Panel, and the purpose of that panel is to distribute those children amongst schools so that, for example, if a pupil is returning from New Regent's College because they've been permanently excluded, they don't all go to the schools with vacancies. And in order to ensure not just that schools have as equal a distribution of pupils as possible, but they have an equal distribution of the types of pupils. Different pupils come with different weightings. So, for example, if a pupil was returning from the criminal justice system, they would come with a weighting of 6. If they were just offered a place because there were no vacancies in Year 7, they would come with a weighting of 1. And a league table of that weighting is then presented to all the heads at the end of the year. And with managed moves, which is a mechanism to prevent permanent exclusions, if a school successfully admits a managed move pupil so that they're just solely on the roll of that school, then they get a weighting as well. So that counts towards the end of year weighting, so that schools can see that this is a mechanism to be as fair as possible to all of the schools. And schools are required to participate in the Fair Access Protocol.
My question was, Chair, who sits on this panel and where is this reported?
There's an independent chair that has chaired the Fair Access Panel for the last 2 years. Otherwise, the people that sit on it, Chris sits on it, I sit on it, and some of my admission colleagues. Fran sits on it, and if, for example, we need the view of a social worker will be invited to the meeting. It's reported to the secondary head teachers group and the primary head teachers when there are primary cases, but there are seldom primary cases.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Do we have any further questions from the Commission? I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask, and one actually about the increased safeguarding risk that these school moves potentially represents, and what additional oversight there is and support provided for these groups of young people. And is there any sort of coordinated multi-agency assessment or referral or support system in place for these young people?
What at the point of managed moves that you're talking about?
Well, I think it's elected home education. I think it's because ultimately it sort of does represent a reduced oversight or a change in the oversight that we have of these children and young people. I'm just wondering if that triggers anything. I think in particular managed moves, because it's seen as an alternative to exclusions, and we know that exclusion and a move and a change can represent a problematic period for a young person.
So, I mean, obviously, we have extensive support with Young Hackney in all our secondary schools that operates to support young people before that point. And obviously, the exclusions officer within Hackney Education is often very involved around those managed moves, not to act as a broker and actually negotiates and works with families around that point. It's going to be a go-between to actually have that oversight to try and make sure those children both leave their own previous school if they have to leave there and move into their new school and have that support within the new school, and that works as an effective arrangement, I think, around, because that does keep young people in mainstream education as an alternative to exclusion. So we have our exclusions officer that provide that support around at that point of transition, help support families around that and does that work. Obviously, you've got, as I say, Young Hackney at the point beforehand. Obviously, Young Hackney sits in the schools that may be receiving it. When it comes to the children that are moving into home education, we have a target of trying to carry out our initial assessment within 12 weeks of education when they first come in. What we've built into that a little bit is trying to do a follow-up visit immediately at that point they transfer into home education within the first few weeks, to have that conversation around, actually, is this what you want? Are there any risks? Look at the issues around why that family's maybe moved into home education and see if we can get them back into school at that point.
I think it's fair to say that if the schools will know the children well, if they have any concern about the child going to elective home education, they would make a referral through FAST to children's social care. So that initial knowledge of the school is a key part of that safeguarding, knowing they will know what the family situation is and whether that elective home education will work.
And is that what we're relying on? Because I'm just thinking more about, you know, the work that we've been doing on contextual safeguarding and the knowledge that we now have of extrafamilial harm and risk to children and young people. So I know that answers the question in terms of any concerns that schools may have potentially about the family that the child is from. But I mean, are we satisfied that in our multi-agency approach to supporting these children once they leave the settings that they're in?
I think it's like anything. There's work to be done, and I think one of the things that I want to look at in terms of the role here is about how we can look at systems that actually before those children leave the schools. I'd very much say that in terms of how we coordinate that, resource that, and develop that. That's a step of go. When we're looking through the sort of the No Year 7 exclusion project that we're looking at, we're running it with at the moment. Some of that is about identifying those risk factors earlier on and having that multi-agency approach that has that oversight around some children that in Year 7 that may be at risk of permanent exclusion. So we have a panel there that meets, that has coordinates, made up with Young Hackney, with 10 officers from my team, officers from social care. So we have that view around those young siblings, and that's kind of the embryonic model that we're then looking to build on. And, you know, at the moment it's still kind of a pilot and trial, but if we can then look at that other children that may be at risk of exclusion and become aware of, build on that. So we do have that multi-agency input around children before they get to the point of having that permanent exclusion letter issued, that we try and have that better multi-agency joined up approach beforehand. That's work that we're trying to run out through the No Year 7s, and it's the starting point of where we're going. It's about how we can learn those lessons and make that more developed, and how that's resourced and how that's supported.
Thank you for that, Chris. I have another question actually on section 5.3, and that was about Annie, you mentioned that we have seen an average fall from 6% to 5% in role movements between years 10 and 11. But given that we've seen quite considerable changes within a couple of schools, and that 7 secondary schools have reduced their percentages, does this not suggest that actually the vast majority of our schools haven't? Forgive me if I'm interpreting these figures incorrectly, but I'm just wondering if we can have some feedback on what's going on for the others that haven't seen the reduction.
Yeah, sure. I think some of them had something like 2 or 3 children move between year 9 and 11, and they stayed the same. So they haven't declined, but they've been at a low number. So as it says here, we do in-depth discussions with head teachers where we've either got a high number or a high percentage. So anything over 5%, we have a discussion, and we have had those talks with head teachers about the situation. So I think sometimes probably some of the ones that haven't reduced is because they're low numbers anyway.
Is that agreed, that threshold? How is that determined, that 5%?
I think it's the national average.
Okay.
Yeah. But we can certainly get you more detailed figures, so numbers and percentages, if that's helpful to illustrate that further.
It would be helpful, and I know that this is probably something that comes up in a number of different meetings about, are we seeing differences within different schools? And I just think actually the previous item sort of highlighted the importance of this in terms of sort of knowing the vast differences in terms of send referrals that depend very much on what school a child attends. So we know that there are these disparities, not just in send referrals, but also in exclusions. And I'd imagine that there will be also these sorts of disparities in relation to these movements. So there isn't any need necessarily for us as a commission to see schools being identified, but it would, I think, be useful for us to see in future reporting the difference between maintained and academy schools being identified, and for us to be able to identify what potentially the difference is between the schools where we're seeing the most movement and where we're seeing the least, because again, that always feels like an opportunity to drill down into what some schools are doing to keep their numbers low and to sort of to extend that learning across the other schools if where possible.
Sorry, Chair. Sorry, can I just ask a question about the 4% threshold? Is that 4% of the students in years 9 to 11, or is it 4% of the students in the whole school? Is that which would be a bigger number?
4% of the children in one cohort. So, and it is from being in year 9 through to year 11. So if it was a school with 200 children, it would be if 8 of those children had moved between year 9 and 11. So there, and that you probably might get some of that movement anyway. And there tends to be less movement in the upper part of the secondary school for sort of people moving house, but that might be just about what you might expect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think I just had one more question, and then I think we'll go for a very brief break, I think. So we all know that children moving out of and between schools have disrupted education, all of which can lead to significantly poorer educational outcomes and longer term impact on children and young people. What are we doing to improve the data tracking and outcome monitoring of these groups of young people who are excluded or who move school or move into elected home education?
I think one of the things we've got coming up is obviously we're rolling out moving from Capita to Synergy, and we're signing up more schools to Orchestra, which is the direct sort of data feed around information from a lot of our schools, and we're getting numbers. So we're doing, our teams are going out doing some positive outreach to schools about trying to get them sign up around data, and we're actually getting a greater number of schools than we've already got signed up, and particularly some new schools coming online. So that will give us a much more robust data basis and by which to actually try and identify these trends, identify these issues by having more and more children signed up, schools signed up to the Orchestra system within Synergy as part of our new database system.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. Unless there are any further questions, I think I'll probably bring this item to a close, but what I just wanted to ask of officers is that, you know, we intend to continue revisiting this, and I've already made some suggestions for how the report could potentially be presented next time, but I just wondered if this is a good time of the year to bring this here, or if you have any suggestions or for a preferable time, perhaps, for it to be brought.
I mean, I imagine probably in the autumn term will probably be a more preferable time because you can report a bit more on the previous academic year, but I imagine there's probably a lot of reports that come in the autumn term reporting on the previous academic year. So it depends, I suppose, on how timely you want and what stage you want that to be looking at. I mean, particularly validated exclusion data, the DFE exclusion data is often 12 months behind publication behind its actual academic year. So the exclusion data for 2019-20 won't be published until sort of July, August 2021. So we're having to rely very much on our sort of local exclusion data, which is less of an issue for permanent exclusions, we know, but some of the fixed term exclusion data that maybe sit under that is not necessarily always marries up in terms of what we've got locally reported versus what's been published via the DFE. They need to be mindful of that. So happy to be guided by the panel and the commission whether they want it, but the optimum time I would have thought been the autumn term for the previous year, but I imagine that's also a very crowded term.
And officers do the visits about off-rolling if they're needed in the first half of the autumn term, so second half of the autumn term, November, December could be a good time.
Noted. We will do what we can to accommodate that. Thank you very much. We will now break for a really short recess.
Chair, sorry to interrupt. Could I ask one very quick follow-up question on the data tracking regarding exclusions and regarding the gathering of data from schools of internal exclusions? I know it's not a statutorily required data report, but I wonder to what extent Hackney would look at asking schools to report that, particularly with a view to our inclusion policies and disproportionality. I think it would be really useful to look at that, because there's a lot of exclusion that can go on internally in schools that isn't reported at all. And to what extent do we have any oversight over that in schools?
I think in terms of the oversight over that, it probably is, I'd say it is limited in terms around the governing bodies of those individual schools. I'm sure it's something me and Annie can discuss about there, but there's no as you say, there's no requirement on schools to report that information to us. But I'm sure we could discuss whether, if and when, how there's a mechanism for doing that, or whether that would be requirements, you know, whether schools would engage with it and how much we get engaged in terms of reporting that and what that looks like. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Annie.
No, the school improvement officers who visit schools do ask those questions, so they have some sense, although it's not verified data. And we have given guidance to governing bodies and head teachers about what format that information should be reported to governing bodies on a termly or annual basis. So governing bodies certainly should be receiving that information.
I just feel that there is a role, although it isn't, there's no legal requirement and it can't be enforced, but in the spirit of inclusion and working together with shared priorities, whether it's something that the council could take a bit of a lead on in encouraging schools, even if it's not legally validated data. Just because the oversight within individual governing bodies is great, but it would be good for Hackney to have a sense of that across the borough. I would suggest.
I think we've heard the idea, and we can consider whether that's but it's certainly possible. I think it's what Chris said about whether we get buy-in and valid data. And I think there's something about, is it for sharing good practice or is it for monitoring? And there might be a different response depending which that was. But if we can come back to you about that.
I think it's too important to consider it around the work that we're doing when we're looking at off-rolling, because in the same way we don't report, a school doesn't report off-rolling because it's something that we know shouldn't be happening. I think as part of those dialogues and questions, I suppose it's something, as Annie said, it can be considered, but it is something that I too have thought of, because there's that work on reducing exclusions, what's monitored, what's expected for, but there's also the issues around internal exclusions and what that looks like, and the impact of that on children and young people as well. So it's definitely something that I'm mindful of, but I think it's how do we lay that around some of the work that we're doing around looking at off-rolling in schools as well. But I'm sure Annie and Chris will have a deeper dialogue around this and come back to the Commission.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're now going to break for 5 minutes recess, so we will return at 8:41, please. Thank you very much. Welcome back. We're back. Great. So moving on now to item 8, the mental health and emotional well-being of children and young people. The Commission has requested an update on the mental health and emotional well-being of children and young people in Hackney in particular, strategic priorities for local services, key strategies to deliver on these priorities, and funding for local services. For this item, we have Amy Wilkinson, Integrated Commissioning Workstream Director for Children and Young People in Maternity, and Sophie McElroy, Head of Wellbeing and Mental Health Services, or otherwise known as WAMS. A paper together with a number of appendices are enclosed within the agenda papers for this meeting. Can I ask officers to just highlight any key issues from the report for 2 to 3 minutes, and then we'll go to questions. So just to let you all know, as I'm sure you're already aware, we are 20 minutes over, so we're hoping to get through these next couple of items on the agenda as quickly as we possibly can. Thank you.
Great. I think Deputy Mayor Bramble wanted to introduce this item.
Thank you, Chair. I will just say briefly, it's our first 0 to 25 integrated emotional health and wellbeing strategy, and Amy's going to go into our priorities and what we've done around that. We understand, we're mindful of the pandemic and how that's impacted children and young people, but especially the 18s to 25 bracket. And then closely behind that, we're looking a bit younger at the 12 to 17, and officers have worked hard to mitigate that surge in the need for support. Something that I would say earlier that Annie and I were quite keen to do is that in schools, in all the messaging about children returning to schools, well, more children returning to schools rather, because schools were always open, Chair, is a real sense of health and mental wealth and well-being. And I don't think we mentioned that in the first segment, that actually that was one of our underlying key themes and principles with children being open to more children. But I'll hand over to Amy to go into the more detailed, Chair, as I'm mindful of time. Thank you.
Thank you. So as Deputy Mayor says, this is our first integrated emotional health and wellbeing strategy. It's been drafted by a range of partners, and it's really here for your feedback, but more given time to make you aware that it's out for formal consultation at the moment. And I know the Chair and other members of the committee have been involved along the way. So we will close the formal consultation at the end of May, so any comments are really welcome till then. It sets out a 6-year plan. There's quite a comprehensive action plan divided by life course, but the key thing around the strategy is that we want to focus more on prevention and on preventing mental ill health for children and young people, and there are a whole raft of ways we want to do that, but we really want to focus on some of the disparities and inequalities that have come out of the pandemic, and link it to our work around resilience as well. Children and young people voted on and worded the vision and the priorities for us, and we've developed a new emotional health and wellbeing partnership, which Anne has been chairing for us to deliver the strategy. The second part of the papers is a report. It's really around where we are in terms of mental health, the impact on our services at the moment, and some key pinch points, which are 18 to 25-year-olds, as Deputy Mayor said, increases in crisis presentations, particularly around eating disorders. So we are keeping a really close eye on that, and services have flexed well. There's a bit of detail on finance, and there's also some data there as well that shows you how we're doing across the partnership. And I think I'll leave it there for questions.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the Commission? Okay, I will kick us off in that case. So on the point about the increase in demand for acute services in particular, I just wondered if this tells us anything about the drivers, and if that, for this increase in demand. And I'm wondering if this is being seen anywhere else in London, if there's anything that we're able to any key learning that we're able to take from this.
Yeah, so there was a query around the data that's sort of linked to this, and just to explain the access data a bit further, it's based on estimated prevalence of need. So we estimate that roughly 10% of the population have a diagnosed mental health condition, and around 30 to 40% of those are accessing services. So we've got a lot of unmet need, as you can see. If you look at the data, we're the best across North East London, but that is still not great. And I think the drivers, these kind of figures came from pre-pandemic, and what we've seen is a doubling of the crisis demand since pandemic. And that's around a whole range of things, around lockdown, around not being in schools, around that 16 to 25 age group not working, not seeing futures for themselves, and general anxiety and depression, which we know is replicated all across North East London and all across the country, and particularly in London as well.
Thank you. Jo.
Thank you. One of the trends highlighted in the report is the increased number of children who are late presentations or who are not known to the CAMS service. Given that this would suggest that there are issues with the accessibility or acceptability of preventative services, can you tell us how the local CAMS partnership intends to respond?
Yeah, so this is one of the drivers behind the integrated strategy and behind the investment that we've made in WAMS, so our Wellbeing in Schools programs, increasing capacity there, and our mental health support teams in schools delivering clinical interventions. So we're really conscious of the issues around access, and that's why we want to load our investment towards prevention, and also take services and interventions to where children are, so to schools, to youth clubs, and out. We've sped up our online services, which are reaching children and young people really well, and we're also working through our Young Black Men's program to commission more services for Black African and Caribbean heritage groups, particularly up to 25. So we are conscious of some of our access issues, and are looking at some ways of exploring those, but I think we've still got quite a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Councillor Gordon.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, in terms of WAMS, I mean, it's obviously, as you've indicated already, a sort of key building block in terms of wellbeing and prevention. Can you tell us how the programme's been evaluated, because it's still sort of relatively new, and can you update us on the next steps, the programme and the enhanced offers for schools, and also, how effective do you feel that this has been in terms of prevention, and is there any further steps that any recent learning in terms of how this service can be enhanced?
Yes, Sophie will take that. Fire away.
Hello. Okay, so it's a series of questions there. Bear with if I have to ask for a repeat. In terms of evaluation, there was a formal evaluation that was carried out during the pilot period of the programme in the first year, and that's available, and I can share that around if anyone would like to read it. Since that time, however, we have the WAMS programme has expanded significantly in that it's rolled out to another 39 schools on top of the original 40 that we piloted in. The evaluation framework is really still under construction because it is still a growing service, and it's also expanded with the addition of mental health support teams, which Amy mentioned, which provides direct intervention, low-level early intervention to children and parents within the school setting. Sorry, could you remind me, Councillor Gordon, of what the other questions were in that? Has the sound gone, or is it just me?
Sorry. Yeah.
Broadly, sort of next steps, the WAMS programme, how is it going to be maintained, developed? Do you anticipate any challenges in maintaining the service?
So next steps are, as I said, we have WAMS is in 69 of our 80 state maintained schools in the borough, and we're also running a pilot in 5 of the independent Haredi schools in the borough. But that does mean that there are a number of schools, both state maintained and independent schools, alternative provisions, etc., who are not currently part of the WAMS programme. Now, they are invited to participate in all the universal events. So we have a half-termly universal training for staff. We have a WAMS network forum once per term, but we are really increasingly aware that we haven't got full engagement with those schools. So I'm putting together a proposal currently around how we actively engage those schools that are not currently part of the WAMS programme. The challenge there is that currently we don't have any further resource, and that resource comes in the form of an allocated CAMS link clinician, as well as support from Wellbeing Framework Partners, who are our colleagues from Hackney Education, school improvement partners. And we don't have the budget or funding to roll that element of the work out into those remaining schools at this point. So that's a challenge. However, we're working to look at the resources that we do have in order to include those schools in terms of consultation inclusion in the events that are ongoing. There are ongoing challenges as part of the WAMS programme, not least that we have operated throughout the WAMS programme at somewhere between 10 and 20% of CAMS worker vacancies in posts, and that's a rolling challenge that we address every 2 weeks in looking at how we can plug those gaps. And this is part of a more perennial problem in terms of high turnover of staff in CAMS services. That again is something that we're working to try and rectify by looking at our data and seeing if we can provide a form of cushioning within those services. That is a work in progress.
Sorry, can I just ask you?
Sure.
Quick supplemental. Yes, I mean, in terms of the WAMS programme as well, how much do you ensure that the voices of young people and other service users, am I being heard? Of young people and other service users are heard, and input into shaping these services. And you've already talked about, making sure that the services serve the need of young Black men. Are there any other sort of groups of protected characteristics, particularly LGBT children, maybe boys generally, any other groups of children which, is the service reaching all the children that needs it, particularly ones with protected characteristics?
Yeah, really important questions.
And what other areas? So,
so in terms of WAMS specifically, the important thing to know about WAMS is that it is a provision that's offered to schools to shape in the way that they choose to take the programme forward. And the way that they do that is by carrying out an audit once per year, supported by the CAMS worker and their Wellbeing Framework Partner, to identify areas for development. And one of those areas, there are 9 areas for development. One of them is pupil voice, and another area is diversity and inclusion. And each school typically will choose 3 areas out of the 9 to work on each given year. So it's a very dynamic action plan. And in the very best examples, it's part of the school improvement plan. So I can't give a comment on all the schools that are in WAMS as to how far they're working or how deeply they're working on those areas, but certainly a number of them are. But it's very much up to that school. The school has that choice to make about where they choose to develop their practice. There are other areas across CAMS services that focus very firmly on LGBTQI+, for example, working specifically with the off-centre colleagues and developing an LGBTQI approach across all CAMS services. And I've also mentioned, for example, that we have a WAMS pilot running in the Heredia community in independent schools there. So that's a couple of examples of how we're making sure that we're speaking to a number of different communities and trying to improve access for those community members.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I just have one last question, actually, and that's about waiting lists. So I know that we've spoken about accessibility or the extent to which particular young people from particular backgrounds are accessing services, but I just wonder if there's a broader picture of waiting lists and any pressures that are resulting in waiting lists and how long these are.
I'll start. I don't know if Sophie wants to follow up, but we've always had waiting lists, and these have varied sort of in length. They're slightly longer at the moment, although the way that some of the services are working means they're more flexible and they can see children and families and make contact more quickly. I think one of our really key areas of pressure, and we're finding this difficult to mitigate slightly, is around our beds and our tier 4 beds. So children are needing residential placements, and across North East London and across London as a whole, there's a shortage. So we've commissioned a community, a sort of step down service, working together with children's social care and education around support for children as they discharge from that service, and trying to keep them in just only until they really need to be in, and then discharge them safely. So that's a key area of pressure. I think that's probably the most significant one at the moment. Sophie, did you want to pick up anything on the wait list?
Yeah, I suppose it is that much higher level of more acutely unwell young people who are presenting both at tier 3, which is specialist camps, into specialist services, and also then into tier 4, which is inpatient services, and that in itself is having a push down effect on lower levels of need. And so the way that we're trying to approach that is through a long list of mitigations which are included in the papers about how we're trying to work, thinking about from the bottom up as well as the top down. So just coming back to WAMS for a moment, we've directed schools, or not directed schools, we've indicated to schools ways in which they can work to identify young people and support young people potentially while they're on a waiting list for a service, making sure that schools use their WAMS clinician to support the school and the young person in the setting to meet their needs whilst they're waiting for services.
Thank you very much. I think that's probably it for our questioning, and I'm just thinking about. I think that this has to be one of our priorities as a commission, particularly in light of the previous year. So I would like to see this come back again, but perhaps what we can do is meet with you both in the coming months to determine what the focus should be, as things, lockdown restrictions change, and we get a better sense of the lay of the land. So I think that's what we'll do going forward. Thank you so much for the report. Can see a considerable amount of effort has gone into that, and thank you. Okay, now we will be moving on to item 9, which is the Children and Family Service Biannual Report. Activity from Children's Social Care is reported twice yearly to the Commission so that it can maintain oversight and monitor levels of service provision. Usually this report would record activity for the first 6 months of 2020-2021, which is April to September 2020. However, due to the impact of the cyber attack on the council, full data is not available. We have Anne Canning, Group Director for Children and Education, and Annie Coyle, the Director of Children and Families, for this item. The report sets out some of the headline data from the activity from the full year to April 2021, together with a more detailed piece on plans to review and reform the Hackney model of children's social work. Given that this latter piece of the report speaks more to the work required in the Ofsted Action Plan, which is another discrete item on the agenda, on a later agenda of the Commission, and that the proposals detailed in the report require careful scrutiny, I suggest that we firstly review the main data at pages 1 to 2 of the report, and if we have time, to ask Children and Families to present the next part of the report, taking the Commission through the main principles and proposed developments within the review of the unit model. Is that okay with you? Okay, given the limitations of this meeting, I suggest that we revisit these developments when we look at the Ofsted Inspection Action Plan in July later this year, if that's okay with you. Okay, over to you, Annie and Anne.
Good afternoon. Councillor Bramble, did you want to say something before I started? Or not?
Anne, I'm just conscious of time, so maybe when questions come up, I can contribute then. Thank you.
Yeah. And though I'm conscious of time, I just, as a follow-up for the last presentation, I can't say how much I applaud the attention that you hope the scrutiny panel will give in the next year to the last topic, because I think in the settlement of recovery, whatever that means, back into, schooling and engagement with life and the world, for young people, a focus on equity of access to health and wellbeing service is critical. So let me just move on to this. This is given usual standards, a fairly short report. And I note your point about the kind of Hackney model development, so I'll just concentrate on the first few parts of it. We went into COVID from a full ILEX inspection in November 19 and a significant increase in activity in the front door. So when COVID started, the service itself was actually a very busy service. We then, during this last year, had some critical events. You've mentioned the cyber attack, for us, the kind of heightened interest in practice from the Black Lives Matter was very critical to how the service responded over the year. And I don't think we ought to also comment on the reorganisation of the service, the split of children and adults, and the kind of leadership changes that are coming through. Annie has been an absolute stalwart in service delivery during this last period, but there is a permanent person taking over in beginning of July. The group director takes over at the beginning of August. Key leader, the head of corporate parenting, has left, and we've got an interim, very good interim, Laura Bleaney. So though the service is held well by the leadership, for colleagues through it in a very unsettled context, that's quite a significant factor to consider. COVID brought with it a complete change to virtual working, and putting aside the impact that had on the professional practitioners, for young people, the way of engagement was quite significant. So their usual experience of a face-to-face meeting was not always the way that they engaged with practitioners. And I think through this, just gives some reassurance to the scrutiny that critical face-to-face meetings continued all the way through the pandemic. And when opportunities arose and whatever the government guidelines were available for us to do face-to-face meetings more generally, for example, with young Hackney provision in holidays, we certainly delivered them. And of course, through this next phase, we're returning to a more settled direct face-to-face. So I think that's one thing it's obvious to say, is to point out the kind of impact of the way of engaging with young people. Initially, I think many young people found face-to-face quite exciting. It was different and gave a different way of engaging, and they saw a world of their practitioner or their social worker, whoever it was, dealing with them in a different way. But over time, I think they missed the face-to-face, and the reintroduction of that at first, no doubt, through different settings, indeed outside, but that's a real priority of the service through the next phase. Cyber was such a significant malicious act for the children and young people of Hackney, and I say that very strongly. We lost access overnight to key critical documents, the Mosaic, the eDocs, the Child View, which is the youth justice. Our IT colleagues immediately came up with interim solutions and Google Forms while we set about recovering the data from Mosaic. And we did set up an interim social care database and a live reporting system from January. But there was a very significant period where access to data and the management of data was severely disrupted. We now know that a significant amount of the Mosaic data has been recovered, though it's not accessible to practitioners yet because there has to be due diligence of it. And of course, that Mosaic data interacts with other sections of the system. So I mentioned the eDocs, which is our repository it's like a document filing, and that hasn't been recovered yet. So we hope over, quite soon through this, staff will have access to to the Mosaic data on a read-only basis, but the return to a full functioning database will probably not happen in all its manifestations until well into the rest of this calendar year. And I do think we need to put that on the table for the risk at which the practitioners have been working through. We have got some data in this report. It's very difficult to compare the data for a whole host of reasons. Not least, we've lost access historical data through the cyber attack. The impact of COVID, closing schools, opening school, you know, when I say closing schools to the vast majority of pupils, but of course we kept them open for vulnerable children and children of key workers. And when we put those two key events alongside a significant practice change, which I know is going to be a discussion at the next scrutiny meeting, which goes right from the front door to much more multi-agency, right through a redesign of the Hackney model, direct case allocations. It's very difficult to say almost scientifically which is the true origin of the changes. But what I can say up to, you know, for the calendar year 2021, the number of children that are looked after and the number of children that are on child protection stayed relatively static. And they're because they're children in the system, and moving them through the system was more complicated during the pandemic, not least of which is access to perhaps services that would help them on their journey through. What we did have is a significant reduction in contacts. It's down 29% during that year. And it's been fairly seasonal. When schools have opened, contacts have gone up. But that reduction in contacts is not only through schools closure, it's also through the significant work that you'll hear about at next scrutiny that's happened at the front door, which is a much more multi-agency approach with a consultation line and the inclusion of experts from education and young Hackney about making sure that when a contact comes in, it's referred directly as possible through the right pathway. So those contacts to referrals, they've gone down significantly. They've gone down about 40% from 1920 to 2021. And the assessments, the contacts to assessments, they've gone down a bit, but not that much, which I think provides some reassurance that the correct decision is made about the contact coming through to an assessment. There are some significant things that have improved. The completion of an assessment within 45 days if you compare 1920 to 2021, gone up from 64 to 77%. And if we look at live data now, that's closer to 90. We are watching very closely activity through the system. And it's true to say that there are, to give you some reassurance that all through COVID, the DfE have asked for regular reports back through to them across the whole of the country around data referrals, narrative data about any kind of key cases we've observed, and qualitative data about numbers through the front door. I think they're trying to do a significant analysis of what the impact of COVID has been, but I think there are many areas like us that have seen a significant reduction in time that is now rebalancing. But for us in Hackney, it's not going to go back. If the practice developments have been as effective as they should be, we don't want them to go back to their original levels. We want to feel confident that the practice developments mean that the young children and the families in Hackney get a referral that is more proportionate to their need. So I'll stop for a moment, Chair, and I've parked the Hackney model issue because I know you want to deal with that later, though both Annie and I could ask any questions on that if you wanted to bring it up now.
Thank you. I think given time, I think it would be best for us to approach that in more depth at the next meeting. And in terms of questioning, can I ask if members can start with questions on the cyber attack, followed by leadership changes, and then 2021 data, if possible. So starting with the cyber attack, do I have any questions from the Commission? So Councillor Peters, Joe, and then Joe.
It will be very interesting when we come around to it to hear about these practice developments, but Has the loss of access to historical data as a result of the cyber attack led to a limitation of our ability to protect children in Hackney? And if so, how?
Gosh, that's a difficult question. I think the reassurance I would want to give you is the way partners stepped up to give us support in accessing their historical records or doing checks for us. So for example, the police immediately stepped in the front door, had put a suite of officers on so that when referrals came in, they could do extensive checks on the referral, which they wouldn't normally do. So that, you know, the referral check by the police is usually much more proportionate than what they've been doing all the way through since COVID. So it would be not appropriate for me. It would not be. I couldn't securely say to you that it has not had an impact. What I can securely say to you that we've done everything possible to mitigate any chance of an acceleration in risk or cases that haven't come through. We work very closely with schools, particularly when schools were not open to the full community, and Children's Social Care and Hackney Education work very closely with school staff to make sure that the most vulnerable were contacted regularly and that there was close connections between the social worker or the school in the contact of the child for those high-risk cases. So I can give you lots of examples where we quickly brought into action other ways of dealing with it, which is not the same as having the historical data securely there. So I can't, I can't in any way, say that we've been able to completely cover off any risk by not having access to the historical data. What we have had is extraordinary partnership working to support us through this critical period.
Thank you very much. Jo?
My question was what impact cyber attack has had on the response to the Ofsted inspection outcomes and the subsequent action plan, and also how it might impact the further re-inspection down the line.
So, in credit to the service, that when we first had COVID, from that period up until the cyber attack, there was full steam ahead with the developments in the Ofsted action plan. And I think once we reset ourselves to get as secure as possible response to managing cases coming through, we've gone back to look at the areas for improvement for Ofsted, and they absolutely marry up to the Ofsted action plan and our practice development and the Hackney model and all those other issues. So of course it would be much better if there wasn't a cyber attack, but also, and I don't know if Annie wants to add on this, but the social workers and staff and leaders have been unrelenting in practice development as well as managing, cyber attack and COVID. And I really can honestly say that. And I don't know, Annie, if you want to add something on that, because it's been such a development.
Yes, I mean, I think, I'm your interim director for children and families, and as an experienced social worker of 30 years, I think this is just uncharted waters, and not to be underestimated about how challenging it is to run children's services in that situation. But the flip side of the coin of that is that your admiration for just the authenticity of our profession to really know what assessment looks like and families. Also remembering that most of what we do in good social, we reach out to our partners at the beginning to seek information and advice and about families to make the right assessment. So when we've reached back into the partnership, it is actually to collect the information that we would have given them 9 times out of 10 in the beginning. So I feel it's been a very humbling job to have done in the last 7 months, to have watched the the challenges of uncertainty come to real strength through the social work practice, at the same time as really driving that kind of everyday matters for a child and the quality of assessment and the information that you have and being able to evidence that. When we're able to talk to you a bit more detail about the refresh of the Hackney model, I think that will give you some really sound reassurance about the fact that the Ofsted readiness work has never really stopped. If anything, the cyber attack just focuses the lens even more.
Thank you very much. And now if we can move on to some questions about leadership, if anybody has any leadership changes. I just had a question to ask. So the report highlights a number of significant changes in leadership, all of which are occurring at a critical time for children and families. Service in Hackney, with service facing the challenges of the cyber attack, pandemic, and of course responding to the outcome of the Ofsted action plan. What reassurances can be provided to the Commission that there is not only service stability at this critical juncture, but also that it maintains focus and delivery on the critical improvements that are necessary?
So I think the critical thing is the handover and close working with the new Director of Children's Social Care and the new Group Director, and I made a commitment with the Chief Exec to do that, and I've already started it with the Director of Children's Social Care. There'll be a very clear induction programme and handover, and I'll do it with the Group Director whose position was announced only last week. I think the service and practice developments are almost so in train that you can't turn them round. So the recruitment process for both posts was very clear about where the service is going, what the priorities are, our commitment to inclusivity, our commitment to reducing disproportionality, and to practice development. So that's the only reassurance I can give, that the two key post holders coming in have an induction programme that is so intense, they'll be absolutely secure in what they're taking over. The interim post for the head of corporate parenting is being filled on a 6-month basis by a very accomplished internal post holder who was a deputy head of service, has now stepped up to an interim head of service, who's been in Hackney for I think all their working life and completely committed to it and has been through all parts of the service. And I've got great confidence in her ability to hold that post. So it is difficult, and with the change of chief exec after such a long time, and I acknowledge that, but I think we're doing everything we can, and we'll be very open to close handovers and clear induction.
And if you don't mind, I'll add just a little bit onto what you've said, which is that a lot of work has been done with the head of service group themselves. It is one head of service, not out of 4, that has left it. It's left the opportunity for Laura to step up to, and that they have become stronger over the last 6 months and are really driving some of the Hackney refresh. They're an intrinsic component part of that. And a lot of the work that we've done with the head of service group is about building resilience and being able to instill confidence and future thinking, really. So I feel confident in their ability to just not let go of some of the really key practice improvements that we've made.
It's reassuring to hear, thank you. Do we have any questions from the Commission on the data? Councillor Gordon.
Thank you, Chair. So there have been significant declines in contacts and referrals and assessments, the Children and Family Service during 2021. As children return to school, and have returned to school, and the children's services resume normal operations. Has there been any measurable change in contacts, referrals and assessments? And how do you see the future? What sort of contacts, increased demand do you expect to have to deal with and adapt services towards in the near future?
So just on the data about the reduction in the data, it was partly seasonal, that it will slightly go up when the schools have returned, but the general reduction has maintained throughout the year. And that is because there's been early consultation for some of the cases, or some part of that reduction is because of the early consultation and that close working between schools, Hackney Education and Children's Social Care at the front door about decisions. So to try and ensure that partners, and it's not only schools, partners feel more confident about going back, at supporting the family in a different way without putting them through a statutory, or maybe putting them through a journey on a statutory process. So the reduction, I'd be very disappointed if when I retire, to be logging on to one of these meetings to find that somebody else is reporting a significant increase. I do think, though, when schools return properly and children are in the place where they feel more settled, they will look for, there will be some increases, because they will look for a trusted relationship with somebody they haven't had access to, maybe to have some form of a discussion. So if I was crystal ball glazing, I would suggest there will be some form of an increase for some historical incidents, but generally the structure is set out to ensure that the families get access at the right level without coming into a process unnecessarily. And that's what we've been working really hard on during the last year. So schools are, let me say, the service are expecting that there may be some increase, and there would be plans to deal with that, as we have done before, with additional staff if that happens. But there is a much tighter system of dealing with contacts that come in.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions. I think one is about, do we know anything about who the young people are that we are hearing less about or from in terms of referrals? Obviously, as we've seen from earlier items this evening, that sadly there do tend to be themes throughout the service in relation to outcomes for children and young people, and I just wondered if there any themes that emerged in that regard. I also wanted to ask a question about if there are any legacy benefits from dealing with the pandemic. It seems from your suggestions that perhaps many of these are reflected in the change in the approach to the delivery of services potentially. But I just wondered if there are any other legacy benefits in dealing.
There are legacy benefits. That the closer working across the partners is a significant legacy benefit. They're stepping up, the relationships built to help reduce the risk for young people. That is a significant legacy benefit. Closer working, particularly with schools, is a legacy benefit. The opening up of young people having face-to-face contact as a way of, feeling comfortable talking to a social worker, a practitioner, a young hackney. Don't always want face-to-face, to have eyes of sight in a way that wasn't promoted in quite the same way before, I think is a legacy benefit. I think probably the other thing I'd like to see as a legacy benefit is some of the relationships with the community groups that we've made all through COVID have been so significant, and that's all the way across the council. But I'm interested in hearing the children and the young people, that we found a way of working that we probably wouldn't have had if it hadn't been for COVID. More trusting, more trusting of each other, and it's not, having calls from community groups about families wanting to come into the system has been quite a significant, benefit. So I do think that's worth saying. And when your question you ask about the young people that haven't come in, if the answer could be what I'd want, it would be the young people that shouldn't have. Most of them should have been the young people that perhaps shouldn't have come in the first place, and could be dealt with more comfortably in their original setting with some support from us in a different way, so that whether it's the school or whatever the services that referring it, that we've somehow worked with them to feel more confident that they can hold that family and have that direct conversation with the family themselves in a structured way. I do think there will obviously be some of the higher neglect cases that just haven't appeared yet, and it would be disingenuous, and slightly foolish to hope otherwise, and that's what we're looking out for. But it's a very good point, and we are analysing the data of what comes through the front door to give you a more accomplished answer to that. And perhaps that's something that we can bring back to scrutiny at the next one as a specific, very thoughtful question. So it's not only the referrals are less, but where are the less referrals coming through, and what type of referrals are not coming through that came through before?
I think that's a really good point. I think it would be great for us to see that. I think much like actually the reflections that we had in the previous item about mental health and well-being, that there is probably quite a lot that we can learn from the pandemic in terms of the fluctuations in numbers, and seeing how seeing the increase in the number of children presenting with eating disorders and how that relates to potentially education settings and exams changing. And I just think there's potentially quite a lot of learning for us to do from this, and it's encouraging to hear that some of this is underway, and I look forward to hearing more about it in future meetings. Thank you very much both for that. I think we're going to, did you have one further question that you wanted to ask? Sorry, Councillor.
I mean, I just really wanted to sort of, I think, as I didn't have a chance at full council, to really thank Anne for her, absolutely tireless work on behalf of the children and young people in our community, particularly over this last, extraordinary and challenging year, and also really for the, extremely thorough, helpful, thoughtful and collaborative way that she's worked with us on Scrutiny. I think you'll be greatly missed, and very best of luck for the future.
You will be.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And whatever I've contributed, it was only possible with the support of senior leaders like Annie Coyle and Annie Gammon and other staff who their contribution has been beyond measure, through this pandemic. But thank you very much. I've always been a great fan of Scrutiny when I'm here. Not necessarily the preparation, but it's very good for the service.
Yeah, if I can just quickly thank all the staff in children's social care for their work in the journey back up to good and then looking to be outstanding as a service in the midst of the pandemic and the cyber attack, and just want to commend the commitment to staff, and Anne has been front and centre of that commitment and that forge and that drive and determination to see the service back to where it should be, because that's what our children and families deserve. So thank you, Anne.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Anne. Now moving on to item 10, which is the post-16 SEND strategy, the recommendations. A letter to the Cabinet Member for Families, Early Years, Parks and Play is included within the agenda and report packs. This contains the recommendations of the Commission to inform the development of the post-16 SEND strategy. The Cabinet Member's response will be published in a later agenda for this Commission. Moving on to item 11, which is the work programme. Can I hand over to Martin for an update on that?
Yeah, just to quickly say, this is obviously the first meeting of the new Commission. We'll be developing a new work programme, and we'll be consulting with stakeholders, and some communications will go out to get some suggestions from public and community groups in developing that work programme. What's in the work programme in the reports at the moment is just the skeletal kind of work programme, which includes the standing items for the Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission, and obviously we'll be populating that at the next meeting once we get all the kind of recommendations or suggestions for possible reviews. And obviously from the Commission themselves, we'll be writing to members of the Commission for your suggestions as well, which we can discuss more fully at the next meeting.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, really, I just wanted to flag, perhaps I ought to have done this earlier on, that there has been an ITV news report on one of our secondary free schools in the borough, and the report referenced a school in particular in the borough and its approach to behaviour management and extensive use of detentions, among other things. And I just wanted to say that much of what was reported are things that we as a Commission take quite seriously and have certainly in recent years covered. And I just wanted to mention that this was something that we had noted and that we hope to cover in a future meeting, ideally the next meeting of the Scrutiny Commission, where we will be going through the draft recommendations of our most recent review, which is looking at exclusions, because many of the issues that were mentioned we feel are relevant, mentioned in the report, we feel are potentially relevant to that piece of work in particular. Okay, now moving on to item 12, which is the minutes of the last meeting. The minutes of the last meeting, the 8th of February, are included in the agenda report pack. Do members agree? Minutes?
Chair, sorry, item 4.53 in the minutes. I think what's recorded is actually the opposite of what we asked for.
Okay.
This is my the thing where I sent around a note about presentation of data. So we've got here data comparing subsets against all other pupils. That's what we asked for.
Yes.
But it says that that's not what it says here.
Okay. Thank you.
Do you understand?
Yes, I do. I remember it distinctly.
If you look at 4.53, it's actually the opposite of what we agreed.
Okay. We will amend those.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for bringing that to our attention. Thank you. The minutes agreed with that amendment? Thank you. And then moving on, any other, there are no other items of, it's no other business. Apologies, sorry, it's getting late. Those extra 20 minutes have done me in. Thank you very much, everybody, for our first hybrid meeting.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Actually, we finished